吧，今天是石江山老师的第3讲，你们前2讲听过吗？对，如果听下来可能会很完整，收获会更大啊。今天讲这个题目是亚洲思想在美国诗歌中的善变，有副标题，中期广告有副标题，从费诺罗萨到叶维廉。
是。
其实叶维廉老师跟石江山老师还是很有关系的，因为叶维廉是北大诗歌研究院的第1任主校诗人，石老师是第3任。所以今天的题目应该是费诺罗萨到叶维廉到石江山。好吧？
好，谢谢。
先请石老师讲，然后咱们留一点时间讨论，因为咱们人少啊，一会儿还有几位同学过来。
好。
那先请石老师开始吧。
好，谢谢。对，所以我的演讲从费诺罗萨到叶维廉还是哪的，也可能有一点石江山的也在。但是我要先说一说，想一想这个比较诗学是什么？我们等一下，哎呀，这个，我的电脑不知道这个这儿好，这是第一个。所以这是叶维廉的上。
这个是打勾了一下。
这，好，谢谢。
好，可以。
Yes。我们开始的时候，我要想一下比较诗学是什么，因为这个我的题目美国诗歌诗人受到了什么中国古代诗学或哲学的影响，不是一个比较诗学的题目 in a way， 因为比较是2个，所以这是叶维廉的，他做的，有 A 可能是中国诗歌古代的诗歌诗学， B 可能是西方的美国的，C 是他们的中间，但是中间的时候不是现在有受到了影响的诗，是一样的。如果我们有maybe imagery， 用英文的时候有 imagery， 也有 imagery 在东方或中国的诗学，我们都有 imagery 的时候是一个 C，right？ So it's a convergence。蔡东锡也是一个诗学教授，在 Illinois University， 他的有很好的书是比较诗学has the same, right? But draws another circle around it and says we must take a D position, which is a kind of transcultural position, so that we're not here looking this way, and we're not here looking this way, but we're here looking from the top, right, down. And then we can do 比较诗学, right? I choose a different method, 不同的方法。Well, this is heterocultural. It's not cross-cultural, and it's not transcultural. So this is cross-cultural analysis. This is transcultural analysis. And mine is heterocultural analysis, or mixed culture analysis. My point is that diagrams like these create a kind of fiction, a oversimplification in language and thought, because it draws a boundary, right, around something inside, right? And that boundary is 真的, it's real, it's like a wall. And maybe cultures 文化诗学可能没有这样的，就用 picture 的时候，我觉得是不应该有用，因为我们用这个东西，如果我们写比较诗学的文章，我们已经做一个 heterocultural 的东西，因为一个学者读2不同的诗学的时候，他那个人他的想法是 heterocultural， 当然有2个语言，有2个文化都住在一起，所以他们的想法已经变成是 it's changed, right? So the heterocultural is my term for the analysis of cultural figures like Ezra Pound or or Fenollosa. Okay, so that's where we begin, in a different kind of study. It's not really comparative poetics. 但是我们没有一个名字 right? Heterocultural studies or mixed cultural studies. 现在还没决定应该有什么名字呢 Okay, so this is my first case study. Will be Fenollosa. And Fenollosa has significant influence from 佛教哲学, right? And so my research, I have 2 books on the subject. One is a resource, which I'll pass around in a second. It's just a critical edition of his work. And the other is my own monograph on the subject. And in both cases, I'm interested in how much Buddhist influence Fenollosa has had. Because for about 50 years, no one, 没有一个学者 学习他受到什么佛教的影响 So this is my own research on his heterocultural or mixed cultural 诗学 So he's born in 1853, educated in Harvard. He goes to Japan in 78. 他是25岁，非常年轻到日本去教西方的哲学 right? So he's 25 and he's chosen 到哪个大学？在 Tokyo 大学，是日本的最好的大学 right? 他的学生都是最聪明的学生，最有钱的，最有political power 的都是他的学生 So he comes to teach Hegel and Spencer. In 1889, he creates the Tokyo Academy of Fine Arts with 2 of his students. He is the first Westerner to convert to Buddhism. And his sect is the Tiantai 佛教 or Tendai, 在日本 Tendai 佛教 他的师父，他的老师是佛教的老师，是日本的最有名的天台那个 monk. So he converts. 然后20年以后，他写他最有名的文章 So the character as a medium of Chinese poetry. So 20 years 以后 So 20 years he's a Buddhist, studies Buddhism in Japan, becomes a Buddhist, practices Buddhism. Okay. So 他跟他的学生做一个 a new kind of Buddhism. Take Hegel and Tendai and 放在一起他们做 something called 新佛教 or New Buddhism. And New Buddhism was created to combat Christianity at the 1892 World Parliament of Religions. So 我得用英文一点呢。那个this World Parliament of Religions was organized by Christians, missionaries, to prove that Christianity was the most sophisticated, advanced religion in the world to evangelize other countries. Now, Japan in the Meiji had already been adopting Western ideas, Western dress, Western science, Western military, but not Christianity, right? It was forbidden. So they created a form of Buddhism which would be translated into Hegelian dialectics, Hegel 哲学还有别的翻译佛教的意思在一起呢，然后可以教西方人佛教是什么呢？但是也是比 Christianity 更新的、更modern 当代的那个。So this was the focus of Fenollosa's students. Now, when the parliament began, his most famous student, this man, oh wait, 不是他，等一下。This one, Okakura Gakuzo, who becomes a very famous American author on Japanese subjects, he creates he's the architect for the Japanese exhibit in the World Parliament of Religions and the World's Fair. The inside of these traditional buildings had Japanese art from about 1,000 years ago up to the present, showing the progress up to modern art, showing both that it was older than Western art forms, but also more advanced. So it had blended the traditional and the modern together. So it was an argument being made that they put together very similar to the Buddhist ideas. So his other student, Inryo Inoue, wrote a very famous manifesto called The Preliminaries to Revitalizing Buddhism, and it introduced these Buddhist ideas to Westerners and took the basic idea of zhi yi qian tai, the three truths, and created a Hegelian way of reading that. So only the Buddhist religion is largely in accord with philosophical principles. Who would have thought that the truth was the product of 1,000 years of study in Europe already existed 3,000 years ago in the East? So this is the kind of classical trope. Trope of comparative philosophy. To take one's philosophy and show that it does the same thing as another philosophy, but did it first. So it's a very common kind of dialectical move. And here's an example of the sort of language which we would have heard at this time. I'll read the English. For art, like the diamond net of Indra, reflects the whole chain and every link. It exists at no period in any final mold. It is always a growth, defying the dissecting knife of the chronologist. To discourse on a particular phase of its development means to deal with infinite causes and effects throughout its past and present. This idea that analysis is impossible if it's chronological was an attempt to critique logic and reason in a linear fashion. Right? And so Buddhism could show a multiple layers of causation, right? And thus analysis had to have a wider view, a wider lens. And the analysis of art required a wider lens. 佛教可能给我们这样的 tools 可以做那个 wider, deeper analysis. Fenollosa, this is 他写的. If we take a photograph of the sea in motion, we may fix the momentary form of a wave and call it a thing. Yet it was only an incessant vibration of water. So other things, more things, apparently more stable, are only large vibrations of living substance. And when we trace them to their origin and decay, they are seen only as parts of something else. And these essential processes of nature are not simple. There are waves upon waves, processes below processes, systems within systems, and so on forever. So, in this one paragraph, written in the late 19th century, we see one of the first times in English language this kind of Buddhist philosophy is written down. Right? This is a most common explanation using the wave. And the Japanese philosophers use this language all the time to make their points. They're all talking in some ways about zhi yi, and so it's important to remember his idea of the mean. So the reality of the mean is not only substance or existent, nor void or non-existent, 不是有也不是无, but a reality which is both at the same time. Extremes of materialism and nihilism, the mean is found in a third principle between the two, suggesting a combination of categories of existence. The mean is both. This is important because, of course, Hegel has it that you have thesis, antithesis, synthesis. 如果它是 synthesis, we're done. You can't have an antithesis to this. So it's a finishing of the Hegel's project. So this was the argument. It's a really fairly sophisticated and interesting argument made in the 19th century. Okay, so I'm stopping here for a minute. If this is Fenollosa's writing, right, then it has a deep influence on his thinking. So when he writes this essay on the Chinese character, everyone has assumed that he has the same idea as Ezra Pound. And so I'm going to start talking about how Pound and Fenollosa's ideas of the character are totally different. Because Fenollosa is Buddhist, his thinking is Buddhist, and Pound has not had a Buddhist influence. 还没受到佛教的影响 Pound 没有 Fenollosa 有，而是念多了有写很有复杂那个佛教哲学的文章，我们就知道他受到了。So, what is his theory of Hanzi, of the character? Fenollosa's theory. This is it. 汉字是他人的。So what is 他然？我们都有自然是什么？他然 right? I think maybe I'll have a I'll do here. So we know the basic. Do you know this term in Buddhism? 用 Sanskrit 是 paticcasamuppada， 用英文的时候是 dependent arising， right? 是 like basic 佛教的想法的方法，它也可能说他然的。这个意思不是意思是空的，因为它是他然的，别的东西都在在一起，可能说是一个意思，但是不是意思是空的，但是意思的这个也是一样的，也有不同的东西都在这儿，所以不应该说这是一个东西，这个小的东西在一起也不是东西，因为都是空这样的。我看到它，我也跟它有关系，所以如果没有我，也没有意思，是因为This is the kind of 他然，都是this idea of 影响生的。Okay, so what if 他的想法是 what if Chinese character always showed you this? Always showed, not one thing, 有很多的东西 right, is in it. And look at how different it is. So you have, we have the word man, right? Man. Man, M-A-N, phonetic. Man 的想法是一个东西，一个 thing, one thing. 也有一个 soul, right? But a character can have more than one thing. And that gives a more sophisticated idea that there is no 东西, no thing, right? And so when he's using his philosophy to look at characters, he has a very new idea actually, because 在中国没有这样，也在日本也没有的。这是一个人是诗人，他受到很多佛教的影响，所以他看到一个不是真的知道怎么写、怎么读、怎么中文，但是他看到了就知道啊，应该是有佛教的那个，所以 it's really kind of an interesting mistake, right? And that's what I want to talk about. So his idea then spreads from the 东西 from a thing to grammar, 语法也 right? So the 名字没有名字，语言没有名字，都是动词 only verbs, no nouns. A noun is a thing, right? An isolated thing. It is 不可能的. It cannot be. There is no noun in language. Things, 事物, right, can only be points in relationships. And these are always crossing each other, always cut through snapshots. They are not real. They're just like a photograph. photograph is not real because it stops time. 如果没有时间，也不是真的 right? Because time flows. Everything flows, so we can't stop it. This is bad philosophy. So language has a problem in English, he thinks. Yeah, in English has this problem. He says, in Chinese, maybe we don't have this problem. Right? So we have to get a tolerably concrete noun, we have to leave behind the verb and roots and adjective roots and light upon a thing arbitrarily cut off from its power of action. So the sun and the moon. So Ming is a kind of multifaceted phenomenon. It has an adjective quality, it has a verb quality, it has energy, it has many, perception, all these things. Bright. 听到它的声音就知道是一个 thing, right? Brightness. So phonetic language, because its sound connects to this thing, and you can't see 也有别的东西在一起, right? You can't see the other things in it. Whereas here, we can see that there's more than one thing happening. So nounizing, this idea here, right? Nounizing is a mistake, a language mistake that leads to philosophical mistake. So the untruth of a photograph or painting is that in spite of its concreteness and vividness, it drops the element of succession. Right? So when Buddha lectures, he doesn't have photographs, right? He can't talk about photographs as reality, but he talks about flow, right? So something that doesn't have flow is only nirvana. Only kunda is perfect nirvana has no flow. Everything else is in time, everything flows. So language, if it stops on a photograph, right, is wrong. So he says here that truth is a succession, always in time. And I love this one. Let's see here. Even continuous, one cause passing into another, and though we may string any more clauses into a single compound sentence, motion leaks everywhere like electricity from an exposed wire. All processes in nature are interrelated, and thus they could not be a complete sentence according to this definition, but one that would take all time to pronounce, one endless sentence, and never be complete. So the idea that grammar has a sentence with a period at the end, and words that are things, right, all lead to philosophical mistakes. And he's got more theories I'll talk about in a second. So he then explains why logic, in the Western sense, you can hear that he's an evangelist, right? He's a missionary now, at this stage. He's a Buddhist missionary trying to convert Westerners to Buddhism, like his Japanese students. And so he's trying to suggest that Buddhist ideas can be brought in instead of logic and reason in the Western sense. Things, a notion not isolated, not simple, not shredded. You can't chop them up because all things are governed by this interrelatedness. Now this interrelatedness here introduces another kind of idea. It's very important in my next part of the lecture. The idea of pattern. Because yin-yang wuxing and pattern is also in his thinking. When we get to poetry, we can see it. Right now it's just kong, but you can also see organic, correlative ideas as well. Okay. So the Western method is weak because it cannot deal with multifaceted phenomena, only linear thought. Okay. Now, I have to switch. I don't have a slide for this, so I'm sorry. But his idea, which is relevant, is that the West had political power and economic power. They were colonial, but they sought to convert the world to their way of thinking, but they were wrong. This is Fenelos's point. He wrote many essays about this. And he said that it would that the solution to the Western problems was Japanese philosophy, but colonialism would destroy it, and that would destroy us, because they would become like us, and then they would destroy us, because that's what we do, because it's wrong, right? The wrong philosophy will create violence, and so he argued that 100 years from when he lived, China would be the #1 economy. And if it converted to Western way of thinking, it would be colonial and it would destroy the West. Only by recuperating its philosophy and connecting East and West would the future be possible without destruction. And so he wrote about this in the most leading journal and magazines. It's really interesting. Unfortunately, he died in 1908. His philosophy and his students' philosophy influenced Japanese foreign policy that led up to the colonialization of China as well. So you can see the ideology in his thinking was very Japanese, right? And also very American, new imperialist style. But his philosophy ideas were really unique at the time, completely different from anyone else writing. So these are political, ideological, economical, aesthetic, poetic, right, ideas all together, and he writes a bunch at this time. Okay, so now the criticism. George Kennedy, who's very 很有名的韩学家，在 Yale 大学 he said that Ernest Fenollosa, the 文章 the Chinese character 文章 is a complete misunderstanding of the Chinese language. He's right, right? So, why? Well, this is why, right? Because only 20% or less, right, of Chinese characters are semantic compounds. Most are phonosemantic compounds. Phonetic elements, semantic elements together. So most of them are not there. So 我开始我是那个在伯克莱的时候学到比较诗学或者别的韩学家做的教的课，都听到Fenollosa 是一个坏人，因为他的想法都是错了不应该读他的文章是 terrible made like major mistake and teach Westerners bad ideas about Chinese. Hate him. He's a dirty word. And that's because his ideas 是真的，但当然是错了 right? They're not correct. Okay, so Hugh Kenner, so this is 韩学家 Hugh Kenner 是Pound 的批评家 he's 可能是最重要的 20th century 诗学的学者 he wrote that, as you see, Fenollosa was a derivative transcendentalist, and he took his transcendental ideas to Japan and put them onto Chinese. Right? So therefore, he was an Orientalist, and Edward Said's idea of Orientalist, which meant all of his ideas are Western. He put his Western ideas onto the Chinese text and creates something, and then he owns that, right? And because he's a Westerner and he has the power to represent. So you have criticism from sinologists, criticism from literature scholars, criticism from cultural scholars, right? And criticism from historical scholars. Always critical of Fenollosa. I had the first book. He said, wait, you don't understand, actually. Because 他们那个学者都还没读佛教的哲学. So no one ever could read the Buddhism in the text because 新佛教, all of this was never anywhere near this scholarship. So that's why the heterocultural study is important, because if you don't have the preparation, if you don't know how to become literate in his ideas, then you can't see them. 没有 interesting ideas. Okay, so why have they hated it so much, right? I think it's because they always assumed Pound and Fenollosa were the same. So Pound, right, believed that Chinese characters were pictures of things, and you could make complex things from small pictures. I will send this around. Right, so if you want to see the originals here, you can look at them. So Pound, this is his language, right? Language is made of concrete things, completely different than Fenollosa. Absolutely opposite, actually. And his idea is you have to, 诗人应该，如果你要写一首诗歌，用一个红的意思，用那个红的颜色，不应该用红，应该有一个东西是红颜色的东西放在你的诗的里面，然后有红的意思。Right? So no abstraction, only concrete detail. Right? Get your red down to rose, cherry, iron rust, flamingo. We have too many talk about vibrations and infinities. Now, why would he say that? Because the 19th century Romanticism uses this kind of language, which in English is the same as Buddhism. Right? So you can't see Fenollosa's Buddhism because Romanticist language is so similar to Buddhist language. Only in the long paragraph can you tell Fenollosa is writing about Buddhist philosophy. If it's just one word, vibration, it could be Coleridge. Right? It could be Wordsworth. It could be a romantic idea rather than an idea from Chinese philosophy. So Pound, maybe he wants to get away from Romanticism. Right? He's an avant-garde. He wants to break Romanticism. But he also says he does not like Buddhism. Right? He speaks very harshly about Buddhists and Taoists, right? Because he thinks of himself as a Confucian scholar, so he's always very anti-Buddhist. So you have two kinds of red. Pound's red, you take things, 红颜色的东西, right? Build the idea of red. Whereas Fenollosa's red, you take red and break them down into the things. It's not build to red, it's take red and break it down, right? One is constructive, the other is deconstructive. And it's very clear when you read all of Fenollosa's work that he is deconstructing language, not reconstructing language. A modernist is reconstructing language because he's trying to save the world, right, from the crisis of Western culture. God is dead, right? Freud and Nietzsche have killed him. Reason is dead. Language is corrupt, right? So Pound is trying to recreate language, and it's a very powerful poetics. Fenollosa has a very different pre-modernist strategy. So the next critique is that Fenollosa's ideas are very old Orientalist ideas, right? That China always is an imaginary space to put the Western ideas there. And so it could be the language of Adam, right? Regardless of his knowledge or lack of knowledge, he is motivated by a concept of linguistic possibility that is entirely Western. My argument is that this 东方的西方的那个 ideas are lazy, bad scholarship, because there is no such thing. 国, right? 国 A, B, 没有. You have this because perception creates mixture, reading and so on. So this kind of idea, it means 因为 Fenellosa 是美国人，所以我也是美国人的学者，我不得学到佛教的哲学，因为如果 Fenellosa 学到，他一定不明白佛教是什么呢？ So 没有办法，我只没有用。但是 it's crazy. Of course you have to study Buddhism. 20多年他学到佛教的哲学。那个学者当然也能得学到了，如果没有，他们不能看不懂美国诗学。This is my argument, because the poets study it, scholars have to study it too. It's very simple. So this is the end of number 1. This is 他不是我，他是一个年轻美国的诗人，来到 Fenellosa 的。And it's important, I'll say this many times, but there are many thousands of Buddhist American poets. Thousands, actually. It's the most common religious persuasion for poetry because it is a pervasive influence on the poetry community from 1940s forward. But it also starts in the 19th century with transcendentalism and Fenellosa. So the next part of my lecture will be about the image again and sound. So I'm going to leave the Buddhist terms and go to another layer of influence, which is basically Wen or pattern influence. But I also want to make a point, I guess, about critical vocabulary. So these are the critical vocabulary of American poetry scholarship. So we have to talk about it for a second. The first one, parataxis, placing of clauses or phrases one after another without coordinating or subordinating connectives. So if Pound writes the 红颜色的那个, right? Cherry, flamingo, 没有语法, right? So that's a parataxis. Collage, same kind of idea. Different words, no connecting grammar. Juxtaposition. So these are the 3 most common attributes of modernism. So American modernism have these. This too. All of these are just a part of, if you see a 19th century poem and a 20th century poem, maybe 1 second later because these are a part of the 20th century tradition, not a part of the 19th century tradition. Where did it come from? So this is obviously a famous Wu Jue. And when you translate it into English, you have 1,000 mountains, flying birds vanish, 10,000 paths, human traces erased. So here in the Caesura, but他们不能听到有一个 Caesura 一个 pause. 因为 it's 用眼睛词典就说 right? But between here and here there's a break, and the break is the kind of this kind of break in the line. And so when you translate the Chinese poem into English, you see the breaks and then you go, and so Pound's translations in Cathay were the first English poems, first English modern poems, were translations of Li Bai, right? And Du Fu too. But this again kind of shows you why. So the American poet translator writes, I like to imagine each character sketched on the page, a brush stroke against the empty painting, like the figure of the old man himself surrounded by all the snow. Right? Each one is a thing against the empty canvas. And so it's think of it like an island. 西瓦伊都是一个 island. 这是海 ocean. Right? It's not language because they can't hear it, to see it. And when you look at the 词典, each one is a different meaning, and 没有语法, it's kind of a very good example of parataxis. So the last two lines, we can have one boat, bamboo, hat, bark, cape, old man, alone, hook, cold river, snow. Right? Every one is like an island. Okay. So the American readership, the characters appear to be autonomous, and this gives us a new method. 新方法可以用。英语也写诗跟它一样。Right? And so we choose to create a new form of English based on this understanding of classical Chinese. This is the most famous. Ye Weilian makes this one very famous, of course, because he writes about it as the perfect imagist poem. And of course, in the Yuan dynasty. Yeah, 孤种老树昏鸦. Right? We read this one the first day. So, when you translate it, you can't help it. It just becomes paratactic, disjunctive English, because it's very difficult to see the narrative, right? You have to hear it, and if you can't hear it, you can't feel the connection points. Next. 青山横北郭，百水让东东称. Right? This very famous quote is something that Ye Weilian. So I'm going to talk about Ye Weilian now. He critiques. He's a very fascinating guy. Ye Weilian is. I have a whole chapter on him here because he's the most important Trans-Pacific poet. I disagree with him entirely about most of his ideas, but I think they're great because he makes them. He tells everyone what everyone already knows, so that we can see it in real detail, so that we can talk about it, right? And then he takes his own poetry and he breaks it and he makes new things. So he has to have two hats. 的学者还有诗人在一起是特别重要的，没有人跟他一样好厉害的。But as a 学者，我们不同意，我们的诗学是完全不同，因为他的翻译的想法，我觉得是有点 problematic，but 很有用的。So this is his idea that when you see English, you will see something happen to Chinese. What? The parataxis. 没有, right? We glue it back together. So we take the glue and we put all of the pieces back together in a line, right? And that is always changing the original into something new. Now, Ye Weilian is a hero of mine. I mean, one of the things he did in the 1970s is he took he invented 比较诗学, actually. He's the first person to publish a book with this title. Now there are 20 or 30 books on this title. He was the very first to use the term, to publish the term, to popularize it. His analysis is very important. But most important to me in terms of his 诗学, is that he did cultural studies before Edward Said. So he took like Edward Said Orientalism ideas, but put them into his poetics and used translation to explain himself, using Taoist words, 自然, 无为. He did Orientalism. How could you not love it? It's amazing, brilliant, original, insightful, and useful. So this is his saying that English has corrupted it. So let me give you a little bit of his language, right? So when he's showing the connecting points, right? He shows that English cannot think in a Chinese way. It will disrupt the Chinese. It will break it, it'll basically change it, it will molest it, it will hurt it, it will destroy it. Ultimately, it will colonize it, right? And so he's arguing that that language, the 古代诗学的语言, is a special kind of 语言. It is 物言, right? All right, and I think that he's not entirely wrong about this idea, but it's just how he applies the idea that I have some problems with sometimes. So he uses these two terms, right? And he applies them to translation theory. And basically says that when Ma Zhiyuan writes, right, he uses wu wei to get out of the way, 让山水有山水的自然，因为他的诗歌不是语言，是物言。It's just the characters like that, 书， right, 水，讲，云，都是 like 没有人，没有他的想法在， right, 都是无的 right. But 你翻译的时候 right, this changes. All of a sudden, Chinese is no language, empty language becomes language again in English. And that's the idea that I find somewhat problematic, because actually, if we translated Li Bai into Baihua, what happens? Right? So look on the bottom, like in a children's book, right, or a scholar's book, when you go to something like Li Shangyin, right, or Dumu or something, you look at the poem, then you look down here, 哪首诗歌有什么意思的时候，说明是 right, 用白话说这首歌有什么意思的，或者可以翻译到白话，当代中文 right? So when you describe or when you translate to modern Chinese, you come into the same problem as English. But Ye really never talks about that. He only talks about English, right? So English is a kind of violent language, and Chinese is not a language at all. Chinese is the world, 自然。中国诗人是无为，能无为，然后翻译家 right, 放他们的语言在那个诗人的想法，然后坏了。Right? This is kind of basic idea. And of course it's naive to assume that the language is empty in this way. But my point is that Ye Weilian takes these ideas, he puts them together and creates a new third space. Right? 有无为，有自然，也有modernist ideas, imagism, and so on. He brings them together and creates this new third trans-Pacific poetry. This trans-Pacific poetry then influences the students at University of California, San Diego, and many Chinese writers as well, and then many Americans. And so he creates a lot of new ideas from merging these, and I think it's very productive. Now, Pound is Ye Weilian basically says Pound gets it right. This is where Ye Weilian kind of starts changing his mind a bit, and basically says Pound also has the connectors in it, right? But so many fewer connectors. So he starts to change English into this modern form, which is less problematic for Chinese. And if you look at Ye Weilian's own 翻译, right, his own translations of 古代诗学, right, he uses Pound style, right? He'll be very hyper, paratactic, disjunctive, collage style, modern style, because Ye Weilian 是一个 American modern poet. So his style is a modernist style. And so if we look at Ye Weilian's own poetry, we will find it is disjunctive. And so the Imagists use poetry to break the English prosody and poetic forms. They use Chinese to break the old form, and they create the new disjunctive verse. Right? And Ye Weilian is one of them. Ye Weilian is one of the breakers. He breaks the English, creates the new English. He strengthens modernism by clarifying, right? 他说明 modernism 的方法是什么，从哪儿来的？因为别的人可能还不知道，有什么古代诗学的影响，所以他说去 说明的。And that's important because now everyone knows, okay, here's the influence from the Chinese. So it makes it stronger. However, sometimes叶维廉 forgets this because actually, right, the most important part of Chinese poetry is not disjunction at all. It has very little disjunction. The most important part is the patterns, the harmony patterns that are in the poem. And so there's a very strange problem between English as a disjunctive, modernist language and Chinese as a classical, correlative language. 阴阳无心的受到阴阳无心的想法在古代诗歌。So 没有一个 disjunctive ideology or concept. 是指当代的 idea, right? 胡适以后的有，但是古代的诗学没有。So this is kind of interesting, right? So it's definitely in the middle. 不是 A, 不是 B, 是 modernism. So now we'll talk about Fenollosa again, because Fenollosa's ideas are not Pound, and so they're not post-Pound like叶维廉, right? They are pre-Pound. They're before Pound, but in the middle. So a different middle. Right? You'll like this. So Fenollosa saw poetry's primary virtue as harmony, but his views were silenced by Pound. So if you look here, the research will show that Pound will take these ideas and cross them out. And then when he publishes them, you don't see it. So this essay, the most famous essay in 比较诗学, the most famous essay, hands down, has 2 parts. Only one part was ever talked about before I found the second part. No scholar even mentioned its existence. And then when I was a 研究生的时候，我找到I found it, and it's all about when, and sound, and pattern, and all these things. So it's a very different view of the possible failed future of 比较, or East-West combination, a different modernism, if you will. So I think you probably already read this, but Fenollosa believed that English formalism could be saved. So the sonnet, right, the Alexandrine line, the pentameter, all could be saved. Modernism did not have to cut it. But it was irrelevant and had decayed. Why does English poetry have form? There's no poetics. 没有 诗学可以告诉西方的诗人为什么他们用一个 sonnet 或者用 pentameter. 没有诗学告诉我们有文有什么意思，什么重要的意思。So 可以用中文的诗，古代诗学可能给我们一个诗学，给西方人的诗人。Sorry. This idea. So they both want to fix, Pound and Fenollosa both want to change or fix Western poetry fundamentally. Pound changed the poetry. Fenollosa wants to change the poetics. So you have 2 different strategies for revolution. So Fenollosa follows these ideas in his writing. So this is Fenollosa 的说的. Nature, creating living beings, endows them always with limbs and pairs of divine reason. Oh no, this is 温馨调动. Right, so this is the idea from Liu Xie. And then this is the idea that we start to get from Fenollosa. So when language is formed, the patterns become manifested Tao. This is the Tao, the nature of course of things. And then we have Fenollosa saying that that this is reflected in the concept of Wen, of pattern. That the heterogeneous materials of language can only be brought together by pattern, by Wen. Fabric is pure as crystal, blending all of them into visual, semantic, and sonic patterns, right? Parallelism, tonal prosody, meter. We have to have all of the forms to bring them together, to synthesize them. This is Fenelos's notebook, right? So if you look at his notebooks, we can very clearly see that he's studying a more deep level of Chinese poetry than any sinologist at his time. Why? Because he's at the University of Tokyo, right? He has the best classical Chinese professors anywhere outside of China, and arguably even in China, because it would have been hard to access them for him. Maybe they would not have taught him, right? So the Meiji gave him access to this information in a very unique way, and he studied it. So he understands that about yin and yang, parallelism, and so on. You can see it in his notes. So when he's using these ideas, and you know he has them, you can see them in his philosophy of translation. So let's see. We know Pound's translation, right? This is Fenelos's translation. So here we have the line. Up here, we see the feet structure. He's using Alexandrine lines in 6 feet because we have 6 feet. So he's matching foot to foot to foot to foot all the way through. And then he translates it to try to catch the ear of the Wen in the English. So Fenellosa writes, the Chinese line of 3 characters corresponds to our stresses of the trimeter, 4 characters to our tetrameter, 5 characters to our pentameter, 6 to the hexameter. The proof of this is what we can often make a literal translation into English, giving a measure of English sound to every character, in which measures the long stress is given to the root word that translates the characters, the small stress to the particles, inflections, and unimportant polysyllables. So this relates to my first lecture, right? Because the monosyllable is a root word, so it has a stress. And therefore, it would correspond to his theory of feet, right? But in my theories, I don't use any unstressed syllable because, why do that? But in Japanese, right? In Japanese pronunciation of Chinese, you do have a different stress pattern. So for him, Japanese is a more literal sound of Tang Dynasty Chinese than Putonghua, because his 日本的老师就告诉他，kana from the Tang period made the sounds, wrote the sounds down, and then transferred it to Japanese. So 他们吟诗的时候，他们用这是他们的想法，用那个唐代的声音。So he thinks that it's okay to do that, and so his ideas are very clear here. So you can see that Fenellosa would translate the Chinese poetry to teach Americans how the tradition is connected to correlative poetics, right? So by writing in the form, it's no different. Everybody already heard it. Everybody writes in form. Always meter, always rhyme, right? So Fenellosa's poetry is the same as everyone's. So he has to teach them a different poetics, right? So using the classical poetics, he can explain the poem. And then he believes that he could then convert the Westerners into a correlative way of thinking through poetry. So poetry is a part of his evangelical or missionary work. Because what kind of Buddhist is he? 他是天台. But 在日本, in Japan, the 天台 is also part of the 支砚 or the Shingon tradition, which is a tantric tradition of mantra practice. So they use the sound, the mantra sound, and they study the sound of the words. And so the poetry, Chinese poetry, was a part of the Buddhist practice to have exactly the sound, right, that the Chinese teachers had brought back when they made the kana. So his ideas was that they were magic sounds, that these were tantric sounds. And that would have been very common, I think, for him to imagine. So at some level, sound and poetic form was a part of the Japanese Buddhist tradition as a vehicle for enlightenment, as a vehicle for Buddhist philosophy to spread, or religion to spread. So, I think it squares that he would have had no problem imagining poetry had this kind of fanfare, this kind of function, this method. Right, so that's basically it. Pound would never have accepted the 19th century ideas or aesthetics. Fenollosa wanted to keep them. So when Pound read the second half of this, he was like, I'll use the first half because it's modernist. The second half is romantic, because he couldn't read Fenollosa's deep thinking, only the surface, the prosody, and so on. So if we think about how we study American poetry, my argument is scholars have to know just as much about the cultures that the poets know about. Because the scholars don't know this information, they can't see the information in the poetry. Therefore, they can't read American poetry. The same would be true in China. You can't read Menglong Shi unless you don't read Spanish poetry, or if you don't have a grasp of Russian poetry, right? If you don't have some sense of Sylvia Plath or Duo Duo and so on. I mean, you have to read these translations to understand the influence. So you can't just read one language tradition. You have to read whatever the poets read, right? So for Hu Shi or Wu Mi or whoever, we always have to read, Dewey or whatever they're reading in order to understand their thinking. But American poets often, or scholars, don't believe sinology is an important form of their preparation, right? Whereas in China, it's kind of a given. So this kind of arguments are the proof that scholars need to try to cultivate more heterogeneous literacy in order to read their own tradition. So that then, in a way, finishes that section. I wanted to go a little further. I've told you maybe a little bit of Shi Jiangshan comes in, here, because I think that, the idea I mentioned before that Huang Qingjian can kind of give us a translation theory, right, where, of course, we're going to, 多态换故 gives us an idea of changing the meaning when we 翻译的时候当然是这样, right? But also to use the same form. This is Fenollosa's sort of contribution, that you can still use the form of the poem on the new poem, right? You're going to change the words because it's translation, but you can mimic the form, and that would be a productive way of translating prosody. So we can take the mimicking of the sound of language and produce the something a little deeper than, right? So I gave this poem in the first one. I'm not going to sing it today, no singing. But again, you can see the effort is a formalism. In America, this would be thought of as kind of a game, maybe, a very little poetic value, not avant-garde, very traditional, almost anti-poetics because it's so traditional. But actually, it's the other way. It's attempting to show a deeper form of poetics by using the sound structure. So rhyme, meter, in this case, tones and so on are important in order to transmit certain kinds of experiments into language. And so I do believe that my English jueju and translations are a continuation of Fenollosa's aborted East-West poetry. So in the 20th century, it was stopped, right? So at the end of the 20th century, I try to keep it going because I think it's worth actually continuing, because if English continues to hear and to use the patterns of Chinese, it can learn new things. That was my first lecture, right? 我们应该教英语怎么聆听中国古代诗的声音的音乐，然后它能聆听，别人也能聆听 right? Other 美国人或英语说的人也能，如果英语能，我们也能。But before Fenollosa and before these, English could not hear it, right? So these are more radical than Fenollosa's. Maybe Fenollosa would not like my poem, but that would be it. So, all right, and now we move to another kind of Buddhism. So we have to move now. We're part of the Chinese, the story of Chinese influence on American poetry comes through Japan, right? Because of history, because of the Meiji Restoration period in Japan, and then World War II. Because World War II brought Japan and America together after World War II for Reconstruction, many Americans were in Japan, and so there was a direct way to study that time. But there's also another reason, and that is from my last lecture, the last part with Finlosa. Remember Finlosa's students, Okakura, right? Inoue. Think of D.T. Suzuki, if you've ever heard of him. These are Japanese Buddhist missionaries. And they were in America for a half a century, 50 years, working, trying to transmit the Dharma, in American communities, teaching Japanese Buddhism through that. So Japan had a very strong foothold for transmitting Buddhist ideas. And so, but often they're using Chinese source material. Okay. So they would use Chinese poetry, because in Chan, 这是禅佛教，差不多是, right? Mostly in 20th century, it's Zen Buddhism. And Zen uses Chinese poetry to explain itself. And so when the American students see the Japanese teacher using Chinese poetry, they can't make a distinction between Japanese and Chinese. They just see Chinese poetry and they think this is Chinese poetry. They're not thinking this is a Japanese interpretation of Chinese poetry, right? So the influence is actually from China, filtered through Japan, but the thought is that it's Chinese, and therefore it is Chinese actually, but it's missing this information over here. So my work on Snyder is to try to restore what is it about Japanese Buddhism that affects his reading of Chinese poetry. That way Americans understand which parts of his ideas are Japanese and which parts are Chinese, and will help us get a deeper influence from both. Right, because like Ye Weilian, he's explaining where the influence comes from. That's my job too, right? So as a scholar, so Snyder is a very important, the most important Buddhist American poet in terms of influence. Born in '48, so he is coming after World War II. He's going to be really at the beginning of the hippie of the hippies, right? But at the very beginning, and he's, of course, a member of the Beat poetry, Beat poets, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Snyder, right, Whalen. All right, so he goes to Japan in 1965, and therefore he's in that after World War II period of Reconstruction. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through one poem, line by line by line by line, talk about it, close read it, and then we'll discuss where the influences come from throughout. Okay, this poem is called "We Wash Our Bowls in This Water." It begins with this epigraph here. The 1.5 billion cubic kilometers of water on Earth are split by photosynthesis and reconstituted by respiration once every 2 million years or so. The or so is kind of interesting because it's like scientific, but orso is sort of Swabian, right? It's kind of casual. So that's the kind of poetic way of situating the scientific language. We already know, though, water in Buddhism is one and the same. So we start there. This is the poem in English. Then I'll switch over to Chinese. Okay, so let me read it first here. Or maybe I can do... Can I do this? No, I can't. Okay. A day on the ragged North Pacific coast gets soaked by whipping mist, rain squalls, tumbling mountain mirror ponds, snowfields, slush, rock-washed creeks, earfuls of falls, swirls of rid-edged snowflakes, swift, gravelly rivers, tide waters, crumbly glaciers, high-hanging glaciers, shore-side mud pools, iceberg streams looping through tide flats. Spume of brine, distant soft rain drooping from a cloud, sea lions lazing under the surface of the sea. What do you notice stylistically about this stanza, if you will? How would you describe that stanza? You could apply those terms: collage, parataxis, juxtaposition, right? This is a modernist poem. Almost no grammar. Thing, 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 thing. All the way down. Beautiful sound, actually, but just things. So, where's the Buddhism in that one, right? So we know, we've seen this before, but what connects all the words, right? They may be different things, but they're all made of the same thing. So every word is different, but they all have the same fundamental component or foundation. Each manifestation is connected to the web of the water cycle. So, my PPT is kind of messy here. We have water is emptiness. Water emptiness gives rise to waves. Water emptiness is one with waves. Water emptiness is real. Waves are real. But they're not real because they're emptiness. Water emptiness is the essence of nature. It is phenomenon. Phenomena arises from the womb of water, from emptiness. Let me give you the Chinese. It's better. Okay. So we have that this idea of water emptiness comes from, right, this ultimately comes from this Dharma sea, which is everything at once. Everything is emptiness. And so everything as emptiness gives rise to everything else. So that every wave is Kong because the water is Kong. And a wave is just water, right? And so you have this kind of language all through the Mahayana tradition. Here's another example, kind of more straightforward. We start here with mind. We have the Buddha matrix here. Each of these gives us a different language for the ocean, right? The ocean comes up into a wave, and that is a phenomena, right? But they're actually made of this, and so they are empty. So that, so the poem question is, I'll get around to it in the end, is it parataxis? Is it collage if everything's the same? Is it disjunctive? Let's go to the next one. This is the next part of the poem. We wash our bowls in this water. It has the flavor of ambrosial dew. In this line, Snyder introduces water as it's used in a ritual. So this comes out of a ritual Zen monastery. Cut off from the rest of the poem, it's just one more wave of water, just one more thing about water. Humans interacting with water in a ritual way. The next line of the poem, Su Rongbo sat out one whole night by a creek on the slopes of Mount Lu. Next morning he showed his poem to his teacher. The stream with its sounds is a long, broad tongue. The looming mountain is a wide awake body. Throughout the night, song after song, how can I speak at dawn? Right? So this is considered Su She's his enlightenment poem. Let me talk about it a second. Okay, so these are technical terms, right? These are Buddhist Dharma terms. They are a special kind of terminology. And, this one is a Mahayana idea, like the Dacha. It's a broad tongue, so the Buddha's words can hold everything, right? Total enlightenment. Right here, the wide awake body, the same thing. When Hui Ke, hits this kind of wide awake body, is a term meaning awakened consciousness. But notice that the stream is the tongue. The mountain is the body. Okay, that's the important part, which we'll get to in a minute. Throughout the night, darkness. You can see the kind of Taoist influence with in darkness comes, and all of these ideas come in the darkness. In the daytime, there's no language for it. Right? Okay. So this is Snyder's poem in English, right? Translating this poem. Old Master Chang Cun. I'm not sure of the pinyin here. Dogen says, this is Snyder 写的诗, right? This is Snyder's poem. Lots of quotations. Dogen says, Dogen says, sound of streams and shapes of mountains. The sound never stops and the shapes never cease. Was it Su who woke, or was it the mountains and streams? Billions of beings see in the morning star all become Buddhas. If you, who are valleys, streams, and looming mountains, cannot throw some light on the nature of ridges and rivers, who can? Right, so this is a debate inside Chinese Buddhism at the time between those who believed that inanimate objects like rocks or trees had Buddha consciousness, or was it just human beings that could have Buddhist consciousness, right? And so Sudongpo's teacher takes the inanimate thing sutra, this particular sutra, and is explaining the sutra here, right? All things are Kong, all things are empty, all things are Buddha consciousness. This in Snyder's translation, right? This one, if you can't do it, who can? Nishushe, who is the you in the poem, right? Or in the sutra, it is the reader. The reader becomes the you being addressed by Sudongpo's teacher. All right, so in this poem, when you get to the end, this is the last line, right? The last one is, if you can't see this, who will? Is asking the reader to also become enlightened, right? By seeing that the reader and the stream and the mountain are all empty. All made of what? Water. So the poem's all about emptiness, right? So the question is, does a Western literary criticism have the right tools to analyze this poem? So when we look at it, we have a kind of debate about Snyder's work. Is it open work or is it a closed work? Open is paratactic, disjunctive, juxtaposition. Pound is open because no one can decide its meaning finally. But Snyder's poetry is not open because Snyder knows what it means. Pound thought he knew too, of course. But Snyder's poems are very closed. They're didactic. 他要教人, this is his kind of style, right? They're very closed. So many people call his poetry conservative, right? And that it's didactic in this way. So the question is, are these terms really useful for Snyder? Because if a closed form doesn't allow someone any other meaning, then it only has one voice. Right? An open one gives people many different meanings. Is the kind of juxtaposition of our terms. So while Snyder is, let me see, I'll give the Chinese. Give me a second. While Snyder is disjunctive and seemingly has open form, by the end he is teaching it, and he takes all the differences and reduces them to one difference. So the poem is filled with differences, openness, until you get to the end, and then the meaning is to go back and say there are no differences, 都是空的, right? Everything is empty. So if everything is empty, is parataxis possible? From a Buddhist perspective, is parataxis even a possibility? Right? Okay. So the differentia in the poem becomes something like this, right? 是我的事. Maybe there's already 可能已经有它. So if everything in the poem is emptiness, right? It might look like this, but it wouldn't look like this because of language, right? Because this poem, Kong is empty. Let me give this to the Chinese. In language, we're going to read it as Kong. Kong 是一个 adjective on Kong 是一个 adjective on Kong 是 like this, and so it starts emptying Kong. Kong gets emptied by Kong by Kong by Kong, and so it becomes much more like Tibetan Buddhism, not Japanese, not Chan in the Japanese sense at that time, but more like Madhyamaka or Tantric Buddhism, because it is a different kind of Buddhism. And Snyder believes in one ocean, right? Whereas this kind of poem would be no ocean. You can't say ocean. There cannot be one. So this is the difference between different kinds of Buddhism, and it helps us understand what kind of Buddhism Snyder has. that there are different kinds of Buddhist philosophy. So if we apply Buddhist thinking to the poem, we can start to see, okay, it's like this kind of Buddhism, not that kind of Buddhism, and we can start talking about its history and so on. Without it, we are left to talk about open and closed and things like that. And that becomes a much less interesting conversation than we would have if we were asking it very specific historical questions about what kind of Buddhism is it talking about. For Snyder, all Chinese poetry has this Buddhist kind of meaning to it, not all, but most. When he talks about it, usually it's to try to open the mind to Buddhist thought. And that's because that's how Chan Fojiao uses, right, Chinese poetry to break the mind, to try to open it up to new meaning. Whereas Chinese poetry have many possibilities. And that's just one very religious understanding of Chinese poetry. So this is, the basic argument up to this point. How do we use this kind of mixed cultural studies to analyze maybe most art, but definitely art where the poet is themselves working on multicultural or heterocultural materials, or who live between cultures? The critics must apply the same kinds of complexity to it. The last slide is this poem. And I would say this is the final poem of the Snyder, maybe also of Yewelian's tradition too. This is maybe the final American modernist trans-Pacific Buddhist poem by Bryce Marden. And it's the final one because Yewelian in the modernist tradition is very eye-centered. His own poetry is not. He uses his ears for his poetry, but his criticism is about the eyes. His philosophy of Ziran, Wu Wei, also uses the eyes. Whereas his poetry uses his ear and he uses grammar and he's very different. But Snyder uses Chinese poetry mostly for the eyes. Pound for the eyes. Fenollosa, yes, but no one read him. So this line comes up to this final English poem. And it's not Chinese and it's not English, but it's perfect. It's the final trans-Pacific Buddhist English poem. Because ultimately that's where they all want to get to. This kind of empty language which is silent. And so I think that that's a very important tradition, but is missing what Fenollosa would have, I thought, brought into the mix, which is pattern and sound. So that's where I wanted to end today. So thank you very much.
深入的演讲，其实这个话题呢，可能对于中国的学者并不是一个完全陌生的话题。比如说从费诺罗萨到施耐德有很多讨论，包括我看过一本书可能您也很熟悉钟灵的中国梦美国诗。
Yeah.
但是我听了您的演讲之后，我觉得那本书是一本通俗读物，一般的、简单的，因为您把这个后面很多复杂的这个层次全部展示出来，
That's right.
这让我大开眼界。而且背后有一个整体的一个方法论的思考，就是您说的那个复文化，用复文化的方式来重新讨论这些命题，而不是简单的东方西方的这些比较。对，我觉得非常让我真的是很有启发。
Well, I believe it's true. I mean, this is just, there are many dissertations now that are starting to use more of this method. It's just new historicism, right? It's just better new historicism, I think. And mine is only so-so. I think we'll get better at it. We have to read the text, the intertexts, in more than one language and in more than one location. And the intertexts are very diverse often. Right, so that's the problem with most of the Pound scholarship. Well, Pound is different. I mean, Pound. There has been some good Pound scholarship because they read the Confucianism and him pretty well. But there was just no effort to really read Fenollosa separately from Pound, and that's the problem. Snyder, usually when you're reading Snyder criticism, it's very heroic. Like he's the hero. And mine is critical. And same with Ye Weilian. He, of course, they're my hero, but I'm critical about it too because I don't want to repeat them because they know how to read themselves. So I want to read them differently. Yeah. So with Ye Weilian, I read him against Taoism. So I use 明相, not 明白. And like Ye Weilian's Taoism is 明白的, 你用你的眼睛, not 明相. So Ming is what? So the Taoist darkness is a whole tradition of poetry, right? Where you can't use your eyes because eyes they can't wu wei, actually, right? So I use the Taoism against Yip in a way. And then Yip comes out better, I think, because it's like dialectical. Same thing with Snyder. I read him as Buddhist, but then I take Buddhist terminology and I apply it to him as a criticism. And then I get a new kind of refined. So that's maybe overly Hegelian, but that's the kind of idea. Same with Fenollosa too. Take what he says and then apply social Darwinism against him, but also try to redeem what he's doing with Buddhism. Don't let him off, but apply their ideas back on it and then refine them. As opposed to using Derrida or Foucault to obliterate the refinement and the language of comparative philosophy in the work, right? So take the same terms back to them. Okay, 叶伟莲，你要用无为自然好，我们应该用老庄thought, but maybe we should think about it like this, So and so Ye Weilian read this, of course, and he thought it was okay. And we are we're friends. I'm collecting his papers at the University of Oklahoma, so and Snyder read it and so on. And that's the thing about writing on living people. You have to assume that they're going to read your work too. So you have a responsibility to be critical, but also engaged in an actual conversation. So that if they reply, you will listen. And that's different too when you're using Western theory. It's like you're powerful and the artist is not powerful. The critic has the theory and the poet has intuition or something. But actually poets have theory. And so we can't hear the theory if we use our own theory on top of it. So we have to listen to that and then use it back on it and refine it with, you can read that I'm definitely a deconstructionist. I apply new historicism and deconstructive logic, but I use the language of Buddhism, Taoism, or whatever to do it. But I appreciate your comment. I know lots of English today. I hope it's okay.
Professor, I have a question. And in your view, what is the difference between the mythos in Japanese Buddhism and the good meaning of the Confucian school?
Yeah. Because it's the same word, but they're completely different. So the mean. Maybe it's unfortunate that they're use the same word as the golden mean. So I'm not a Confucian scholar. I've had to study Neo-Confucianism a bit because I'm studying poets influenced by Neo-Confucian thought to a certain extent, but I'm not a Confucian scholar. So I can only speak to say that that the Japanese notions of the middle path come from Zhi from Tiantai, which came from the two truths from Nagarjuna, right, who in India founded the Madhyamaka school. And so the Madhyamaka said that there are two truths, right, that there's Kong and there's, which is true, right, and then there's not true. That's just two. Zhi added the third, right, and he said, yes, Nagarjuna is right. There's Kong, there's truth, which is emptiness. There's existence, but actually they happen at the same time. They're not a binary, right? They're non-dual, so they're simultaneously Kong and real, right, at the same time. So Zhi took what was a binary in Indian thought, and he applied a non-dual language and created the mean, which would be in this case the combination of existence and non-existence, right, or phenomena and emptiness. And that's what the Japanese use the term middle path from the Tiantai tradition, but it's actually not related to the Confucian term, I think, in terms of Buddhism. But the idea maybe from Zhi did come from Confucianism, because he would have been, of course, heavily influenced by that. So maybe it is the non-dual language has a Confucian origin. But I can't answer it. But it's okay to not be able to answer it, because I reject the idea, actually, that scholars need to be philosophers. That's the problem, actually, because you can't do it all. And if you think you can do it all, right, then you won't try to do half as much as you need to. So the Western scholar will not read Buddhism or Confucianism or Taoism because there's an expert in the next building who does that. But they will read German philosophy, French philosophy, Spanish philosophy, English, over 1,500 years, completely different ideas and origins. What the heck? And not read a little bit of Buddhism so they can understand some basic principles is ridiculous. So, when I teach my students, in my theory classes, I'll throw in and we'll study, historical figures in the Kyoto School in Japan or others, along with Heidegger and so on, because why not? It's just thinking, it's just language and thoughts, and it's translated, in very high level of fidelity by experts. So that's, I think it's okay to not be a philosopher in order to do literary criticism. We study theory as if we were philosophers. We should study, comparative philosophy in the same way, to use it, actually, not to own it, not to represent it. And that's the difference between sinology, which has a representative logic. And I'm not a sinologist in that sense. When I was an undergraduate, I was a sinologist. I knew I was going to be a sinologist from 12 years old, always just going to be it. And then I read Edward Said. Right? And I thought, I don't want to represent Chinese thought. I want to do. I want to work with. I want to work alongside. I want to study its influence. I want to do all these things, but I don't want to represent it. And that's what sinology does. It says, I am authenticated by my degree and my studies to represent Confucianism in Harvard or whatever. And my students will say, he will know what he's talking about because that structure of power, right, is Orientalism. And so I think it could be very dangerous. And so everyone should study hard with rigor, but not to represent the logic of that system as if it were pure or true, right? But in a historical way, to the best that we can, taking translation into account and trying to understand our own historical position in relationship to those texts and those translations and those scholars, all the way back as much as possible, but never be top-down, right? Never transcultural like that. Never from the bird's eye view, always down here in it. So that's my response to questions around, because your question is a pure question. It's in Buddhism and Confucianism, what's the connection point between these two things, and that's a sinology question. So I don't have the authority to answer it. I wrote a paper. If you send me an email, I can send it to you. But it's why American literary critics should use sinology. So I think of sinology as a useful thing that critics should use, but not do. Right? So when you use it, you need to learn it. Like they've worked their whole life. I work for sinologists. I publish a journal. I edit sinologists. I publish sinologists. I collaborate with sinologists, right? Because I think what they do is very important and valid and useful, right? But I disagree with the metaphysics, right? With the power structure. And so as a personal scholar, I choose to work with, not as, a sinologist. And maybe you call it new sinology because it's kind of meta-sinology. I study sinologists too, because that's, for me, real sinology in a way. Right? But I did write about why sinology is good, because the problem in America too is that many cultural critics will see sinology as an evidence model, right? And therefore not cultural studies, not theoretically sophisticated. But actually sinologists are very theoretically sophisticated now. All of those graduate students learned theory in the 80s and 90s. Everything is theoretical now. Maybe too theoretical in some ways, but it's, definitely, there's no reason not to use it and to read it. They don't, which is really sad because we see it as a separate discipline, but it's so useful actually. Yeah.
就是我不是学中文的，我是 I major in pharmaceutical, I major in pharmaceutical, not Chinese, and maybe 或许我的理解很浅显，就是你的演讲给我的感觉是，如果是从中国的儒释道这三方面来谈的话，应该是用这个空无形，这我感觉是道教的这个嘛，然后用道教和那个儒教里面的那个中庸来说佛教，让我感到很新奇的。
Okay, I accept that. Because it's creative, right? I mean, that's, for me, poetics is trying to, it's interpretation, it's kind of creative interpretation, guided interpretation. So you take cultural content and you interpret it. And your interpretation, can be a kind of poetics because you can, take that new idea and make something with it, make a poem from your interpretation of, right, this idea of Buddhism having and kind of Confucian ideas. So if you were to write a poem that tried to put that in, your idea that combines the two, right, that would be this kind of heterocultural interpretation. I think everybody now is heterocultural. All Chinese scholars have so many theories from the West and so on. They, of course, are producing heterocultural theory. This is Yue Daiyun's kind of ideas, and others, talk about the kind of special 中国特色 right now for 比较文学 is this sort of heterocultural idea. So I didn't know about her work when I wrote this. Now I would have to critique the work because that's my job. I'd always want to critique whatever is there because that's how we interpret. And critiquing is critical interpretation, right? So it's, I would want to critically critique Yue Daiyun and others in the Beidao school, of 比较文学 in order to make the same points, but I would make them differently had I read her when I was writing this book. But that's basically the argument that China is special because its scholars have been reading different kinds of literature and philosophy. So when a student like yourself writes a poem from an interpretation of Buddha, Taoist, or Confucian work, you're a modern world person interpreting a classical Chinese philosophy. And thus you are like Ye Weilian or like Snyder because your ideas will be a modern ideas, interpreting classical ideas, making a third new idea. And so modern scholars are always doing this kind of creative work. And that's why I want to study them actually. And 比较诗学 is a really useful field. I think poets should be reading them, these textbooks and monographs on that subject. I disagree with the method of comparison. I think it's naive. But the work they do themselves to create new ideas is great. Right? They just believe they have to compare it in order to say something. Right? They have to compare Confucianism and Buddhism to say their idea. But actually they're creating new culture in every book, every time. They just say this is Chinese, this is Western, and that's not true. It's actually all both, a little bit. Yeah. That's something different than 比较. Yeah. And I don't want it to be 比赛, like competitive poetics, right? 比较 poetics in China is competitive poetics, almost always. It's like Chinese poetry is better than, its poetics is better than the West. That's Fenolosa too. Chinese poetry is better than the West. That's Okukura. Japanese Buddhism is better than the West. Why? This is really important. Because of Western hegemony. A hegemonic structure, we talked about this. Yeah. A hegemonic structure confirms its hegemony when people dissent from it. When people fight back. Chinese philosophy, no one fights Lao Zhuang. No one beats up Lao Tzu. Zhuangzi is violent, Buddha is bad, Confucius is wrong. People don't beat him up. Why? They beat up all of the Western philosophers because they lead to violence or colonialism and all this. Why? Because Western philosophy is still Eurocentric, it's still dominant, right? If China becomes more powerful, it doesn't need to fight anymore. Then it fights itself. When Chinese scholars critique Lao Zhuang thought and its influence on the present, then China will be a world power. And we'll know it because the philosophy and the poetics will all change, and Lao Zhuang will be used to combat power structures like Foucault and so on, and it'll be all part of it. But right now, we protect them from the West, And then so Bijiao is a competitive and it's protective, and I think that maybe before long, if the world continues this way, it'll change actually. And that's why I thought, I have a conversation with Ye Weilian and 今日中国文学杂志, a long one, and he kind of dodged this question, but I asked him, why do you use Lao Zhuang thought to critique English, but you don't critique Chinese? It's language. How could you use it against one language, but not all language, right? 名可名非常名. Language is the problem, not English. Lao Zhuang is not like fighting English, it's fighting language, the mind. How can you apply it to English like that? And he just sort of like moves the other way. But that's the move of 比较诗学. That's the moves, we use it to critique the power structure because it is a power structure. And maybe one day we'll find the ascendancy of Chinese thought, and then Chinese thought will know it when Chinese scholars are trying to contest Chinese thought. And until then, it'll be fighting the Western thought. And then that's only happening because it serves Western power. This is my point. If Chinese scholars fought Chinese thought, it would actually really fight Western thought. If you didn't catch my meaning. Only when Chinese scholars can apply the sort of rigor to it, then you start actually critiquing the totality of Western hegemony. As long as you fight the totality, it strengthens the totality. Yeah. And so that's the problem I see, the theoretical problem of comparative poetics. But the poets maybe start to have a different way by mixing it and so on. But maybe nobody has, I've not read this argument that I just made about it. Maybe there's one out there. Yeah.
Professor, I have a question. First, I feel sorry because I didn't get there punctually, so I may not. So I can't fully get your idea. But when you give us the Pang's theory on characters, I feel interested in it, and I see your PPT, and on that a way of translating Chinese ancient poems is put the words and words and words together, but not a full sentence. And this makes me think: do you interested in Wu Shi's poem translation? I don't know if you are interested in it, but I am interested in it. And when Wu Shi he translates English poems, he used salty, just Xu Yuan's poem, the way he writes poem, and I think the poems he translated is English poems, so they are in full sentence. They are not 碎片. But when he translated his own 武 言 poem in English, he just make it in full sentence, but not the 碎片. And I think maybe this is a phenomenon when Chinese and Western poems meet with each other. This phenomenon happens. I am very interested in it. And Wu Shi, when he is creating the Chinese modern poetry, he has an idea. He says we should write in verse, just like write in prose. We shouldn't make it 碎片化的, but we should make it a full sentence. And I think the modern Chinese poetry, they are on this way. They are not. Most of them are not the 碎片化的, but they write in full sentence. And I think this is I am interested in it. I think it is an interesting phenomenon. So I want to listen to your opinion about this.
Yeah, right. So first off, it seems quite ironic, right, that the classical poem would stimulate the collage English, right, the not full sentence English from the poem, and the Hu Shi would look at those and bring it back as a sentence into Chinese. But of course, you have to, remember that Hu Shi is breaking Wenyan, right? He's trying to not use Wenyan, but use Bai Hua to write poetry. So, this goes back to my fundamental point about Wenyan is a language. It's not words. It's patterns. Both vertical, horizontal patterns with sonic patterns and so on all through it, right? That's not what Pound sees. When Pound sees the poems or whatever, he sees characters, and then Fenollosa will have the word under the character, right? So it's just word, 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 maybe a grammar particle, word, word, word. So that's what they notice, and that's what's new, right? New is this cut, cut, cut. But the new in China would be to use vernacular, right? Not to have this. But they're not rejecting the same thing in an opposite way, because Wenyan is not in English. Wenyan's never been in English. Right? Just a perception of it was in English, right? Not the actual patterns themselves. So that's, my quick answer is just a response, really, is that it's a great paper if you were to write it, because it's basically looking at how two perceptions of the same phenomena, Wenyan, produces two opposite reactions in modernism in the same moment, with Hu Shi sometimes using Pound even as an example, but getting it backwards. The same thing is true with Pound, reading Chinese poetry and getting it kind of backwards. So I think it's a great an interesting phenomena, right, that they're responding to Wenyan in opposite ways. But remember that the whole tradition of English verse, the 2,000-3,000 year whatever, tradition from Beowulf, all of that would be sentences for the Chinese ear. It's all different than Wenyan. Yeah, so the whole tradition is stimulating, not just modernism. Yeah, and so if you look at the difference, weirdly, you might see more similarity with Wu and Pound than Hu Shi and Pound, even though Hu Shi is quoting Pound. You're going to see Wumi having more similarity because their ideas of Wenyan maybe are a little bit more similar, which is Wumi still wants to use Wenyan, and Pound thinks Wenyan does this, and so the English will look paratactic, and Wumi might still write in what would look to an English person as paratactic, but it's not. It's Wenyan. So that's the main thing, is that they can't see Wenyan as a language. They see it, and Ye Wei Lian produces the same argument. It's not language, Wu Yan. It's something different than language, right? Like that. And that's the problem. It's, you're not using, Ye Wei Lian doesn't talk about parallelism or tones or anything. Yeah. So it's always very much a philosophy about the character and the meaning. Anyway, so it's a great observation. And if you haven't written this paper, sometime you should write the paper. Yeah.
胡适跟您讨论这个话题关联度比较高。
Yeah.
对他那个，我们一般都说胡适的新诗的理论受了庞德的影响。
Yeah. Yeah.
他的影响其实是很有限的，就是他也把意象派的原则抄到自己日记里，但他很关心的是您讲到的那个具体性、逼真性。就是这个意象的清晰可以怎么讲？可以纠正过去语言的那种不清晰、陈腐，但是那个断裂、并置这部分不是什么样的感觉？
Yeah. Because it's about change, right? It's about new and breaking the old tradition. So he's breaking from different traditions.
讲的那个现代主义的写作的基本观念，并置、破碎，断裂，在胡适那里还是没有。他只抓到那个逼根具体性，但是这种观念的传进来可能是到30年代，在中国新诗的这个传统里面，在30年代，中国的现代诗人开始了解这一部分，但是不是来自中国古典诗歌。
You know,
来自艾略特这样的。
Yeah. Fenellosa's essay was translated and published by the Xueheng people, actually. There's very little evidence that it had influence in China, right? But they, I think, liked the argument because the Xueheng found that it validated Wenyan, actually. You know, that those ideas were still valid for modernity. They lose the argument, you know, but that's, they kind of, I think, were seeing something that history didn't really find useful enough, because we find that the break needed to be severe for China and for the West. They could not use the 19th century. American modernism had to break from 19th century, and Chinese modernism had to break from 19th century. And so, even though they used each other as examples, in a more careful example, there'd be no break. You know, so the Xueheng and the Fenellosa, maybe they would have had a different modernity with no break, just like that, right? Another version and interpretation of the 19th century. Yeah, it's interesting. Go ahead. Yeah.
Another question. And just as you said in your lecture, 绘画或者照片的虚幻性遗失了自然的联系性。但是我认为的话，就比如说，我认为绘画和照片本身就很美，是我的审美能力出现了问题，还是你刚才定义的这种联系性，过于强调自然的联系性这种审美标准，然后这是一个问题。还有一个就是刚才你说那个翻译的嘛，那个就是那个菲诺罗萨菲诺罗萨，然后是认为那种。就是要追求的一种，就是翻译把那个古诗的那一些格律或者是都要翻译进去。但是你用现代汉语来翻译古文的话，也难以达到那种效果。就是诗，我认为的话，就是诗歌本来就是为了表情达意的那一种。所以我认为刚才那一种不是碎片化那种翻译也很美的。你要是过分吹毛求疵的去追求那样一种境界，而且很难达到的一种境界。就是不是有点因噎废食，或者是也不是因噎废食那种就是是不是给这种诗歌本身就是加了一些枷锁或者是一些束缚在里面？这样做有它的意义吗？用现代汉语来翻译古诗或者是元曲什么的，本身就很难做到。
All right. I want you to use English on just the last part of from E4 to the end. Can you switch to English for a minute? Just the last part of your question. 可以用英文再说那个后面那个问题的后面的那个两个句子呢？可以。
The last question.
Yeah, the last part of your question. 如果你可以用英文更好。
My English is not very good. I have to come back to translate my English. And I think the point is just to express your feeling.
Yeah.
And modern Chinese it is very hard for modern Chinese to translate the ancient Chinese poems. And for English, just like philosopher, they just want to get to that level. I think it adds some restrictions to the poems. to the India, and I think it is some in my view it is a little nothing.
So well, that's because you're romantic, right? Maybe. So that 诗言之 is sort of the right. So I mean, to think about more than 诗言之 is kind of extra, over the top or extra, right? That the pure poetry is expression.
Just like modern 近代诗人戴望舒，他就不是很追求那一种就诗歌的那种格律，过于强调格律那种，它应该是一种舒服restriction.
Yeah, constraints.
Yeah. And I think I agree with Dai Wangshu, and I agree with the poem.
To not have restriction.
Not
Yeah.
What is
费诺罗萨. Yeah.
His view of
Well, that's because you're a modern person. Yeah. 因为你是当代人，所以你的想法是不是？
我很喜欢古诗，但是我认为因为现代汉语没有办法达到那种境界。
Yeah. Right. No, 我明白你的意思是吗 ？I'm just saying. I mean, I know. 我知道你爱你很喜欢古代的诗歌，大家都喜欢。但是你是现代人的，当代，因为所以你得用现代的语言说明你的想法。
We learned about the Asian Chinese, and we can know and feel the situation the Asian poems express.
Yeah.
But for English, I think a better way for foreigners to learn or feel the situation indeed. It is better to learn Chinese or Asian Chinese. Just English is.
Oh, I wish you would have come to my first. 我希望你可以来到我的第一个演讲。如果你来到我的第一个演讲，你知道我有3个小时要说明这样的想法的，因为这是我的题目第一个所以现在可能没有时间告诉你我的想法是什么的。Yeah, so I will just say, don't take it any offense, but I completely disagree, but I think you would enjoy the conversation. So afterwards we could talk about it, I guess. I mean, I believe that there's another path. Yeah. And it's similar to Fenelos's path. Yeah. But I respect this one because it's the widely accepted view of the world. If you want to study another language or tradition, learn that language. I think we should learn. No, I don't think we should just learn another language. I think we should teach our language how to learn another language. We have to teach our language how to learn another language's poetry. And the whole world is filled with the examples of poets teaching language how to hear other languages. That's our job. Not just one person learn another language. The whole language learns another language. Music, voice, meaning, feeling. And then we progress and we widen ourselves. When the language widens, we widen. 如果我们的语言不能聆听别的语言的音乐，我们也不能聆听。教语言是我诗人的工作。This is mine.
I think the poet's way is enough. That's my view, and in recent days I have taught some students from Yukon Mandarin, and I think some Chinese words can't be translated into English. 就是很精切的那种传达的那种意思，只能是用一句话去描述某个词来给他们解释。就是跟那个 Yukon and Kansas 发起的那个同学。
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a defendable position.
是的，我问一下就是费诺罗萨最早在美国研究这个东方，就是这个禅宗的哲学用于这个欧美文学的翻译。他当时研究是在美国做的，没有来日本学习，
在日本学习，都是在日本学习的。
后面那个也是。
一直在日本的。斯奈德在美国，因为他读书在Reed College， 所以他有2个老师，一个是个书法老师，然后他到伯克莱大学去做他的研究生的那个他的中文老师是很有名的诗人，中国的诗人，所以他的学的比较好，在美国，然后到日本去学佛教的那个but his Chinese was all in America. Fenollosa 都在日本学的 ，yeah.
他们都是20世纪的人。
yeah， 差不多25 ，Fenollosa 25岁不知道可能 maybe 差不多，跟Snyder 一样。
还有就是您那个讲座题目是从Fenollosa到叶维廉，叶维廉好像您没听到还是
？Yeah, so yeah, so it was. He was there in the talk. 我这个 title 的意思就是，从 Fenollosa Pounder 到叶维廉，我们有一个kind of trans-Pacific poetics 到这个话去，like this idea that 中国古代诗是一个哲学的，能叫西方人中国哲学的用法，没有音乐，也没有声音，因为他们没有用，空是一个你可以用你的眼睛就kind of study this kind of idea， 所以这是叶维廉跟他们差不多。但是我说明那个叶维廉的诗学的时候，我说他也是一个诗人。如果他写诗的时候是完全不同，因为他的诗是很复杂，他放那个文言的影响，也有西方英语的都在这，因为他用他的眼睛、他的耳朵，他的是很有意思的。他的学哲学的文章的时候，他的想法可能是因为他的读者们他觉得可能是西方人，所以他用比较容易的想法是自然无为，这是道家的，这是他们的意思，我们可以用这2个字明白2000年中国诗学当然是太简单的那个but that's okay， 因为他是诗人
他在世吗？叶维廉还在世呢，还是也是前人？
在世。叶维廉老师就是徐阳老师的前任。我们那个北大科学研究院的助教是第1任的叶维廉，施老师第3任。
对，我跟他
但年纪比较大。
对，不多。
那简单的就是我们从美术角度上，我们知道那个美国的禅宗是日本平埔大祖传过去的，就是这样的。但我们认为它就是一种韵律，就是根据风向对于对音乐一样、诗一样的，它是一个心象。但是您去配这些图的时候，就是说这个平埔大祖对美国的影响，这个诗学的影响大，还是说只是在美学在美术上它的影响？
我差不多都听得懂，但是你的问题很不错，有点厉害。我想知道，如果你可以帮我一点，可以吗
？Well, I don't know how to translate the Japanese names because
Yeah.
They sound
Yeah,
different.
that's okay.
So he says Lin Dazu introduced Zen to America.
Yeah.
And he said his question is about whether his influence on literature art are as important as on fine arts.
Yeah， 好，对，我因为那个日本的名字我也听不懂，所以我听到说，就是好，是的，是 ，Yeah，DT Suzuki，Yeah，DT 用英文的时候我们说 DT 没有得到，DT Suzuki， 美国的诗人有2个 Suzuki， 一个是在加州，一个是纽约， So D.T. Suzuki 住在纽约 ，actually， 还有Suzuki Roshi， 是一个 San Francisco， 所以他是San Francisco 跟那个 Snyder 有，还有 Wayland，Scalapino， 还有别的 San Francisco 是他的学生。但是在纽约，D.T. Suzuki 有 John Cage。还有 Jackson McLough， 都是很有名的诗人，但是 John Cage 也是一个音乐家 ，right？And then 也有那个Klein、Motherwell、Abstract Expressionism 都读过他的写的书，所以 D.T. Suzuki 也出版了很多书，and 我的爸爸妈妈都读过，每一个艺术家、诗人都知道他的哲学。但是 D.T. Suzuki 的哲学也是比较哲学，因为他受到很多 Jungian archetypical theory 的影响，所以他翻译日本佛教的哲学的时候，他用那个 English psychology terms， 从德国来的那个 ，right? So you have a very mixed cultural. D.T. Suzuki himself is a middle creator of new Buddhism, new Buddhist psychology, right? 用 ego 是非常重要 ，egolessness， 没有 ego 那个的时候应该是什么呢？但是因为佛教没有 ego 的字，但是它是在美国是最重要的 idea is the ego, so it's a Freudian term, right? So all of these are new, but very influential for all of this is why the poets have been Buddhist for 50 years in America, because in the counterculture, the hippies, and before the Beats, 都读他。So D.T. Suzuki is a huge influence. 但是只有2个诗人是他的学生 ，Jackson McLough and John Cage。他们的诗，他们用电脑写或别的用易经写，因为他们不要自己写诗，因为他们不要一个 ego， 所以让一个电脑做。或者让易经做，所以他们 throw the sticks， 然后这是我的书，好，这个字放在这儿，这样的，因为如果可以写这样的诗，没有是无我写的，无我是他们的也是有很大的影响，在音乐在艺术，都因为 abstract expressionism is also kind of 没有我。my intentionlessness and so on. Yeah. So this is why they also use the art in the book. 没有很多，但是因为我的爸爸是艺术家，所以我从年轻的时候也读过，听到那个 D.T. Suzuki 是什么。Yeah. 用一下。
继续问一下，就是说，D.T. Suzuki 他主要是汉传宗教的。演变到禅宗，然后到日本又传到美国。藏传佛教在美国也有很大的影响。它在艺术领域在美国的影响大吗？音乐、诗学也是。
在So one more time, sorry, but Yeah, so I mean Tibetan 就是有，但是从75年开始。差不多71年，因为以前有，但是没有一个很有名的老师是the 1970s， 有一个他来到Colorado 做一个 Naropa School of Disembodied Poetics Jack Kerouac School 跟 Allen Ginsberg 跟 Anne Waldman， 还有Chongyong Rinpoche， so he is very important for the second generation Buddhist poets. Really it's third generation. Fenolosa, first generation. 还有一些别的是 19th century, early 20th century. Then World War II generation, second generation, 1940s到early 60s. Third generation Tibetan Buddhist, also Vipassana, so the Hinayana school from Southeast Asia, Burma, and so on. This idea started to translate and become popular. And so the new forms of meditation, right, came in the 1970s and 80s and actually become very influential. within the Buddhist schools. But formalism, like 那个吴我写的那个我刚说的那个 formal ideas of play stopped in a lot of them. The poets are 佛教，学到佛教，但是他的诗可能没有那么大的影响。But the language school, language avant-garde poetry, 从 Philip Whalen 到 Leslie Scalapino, 到可能也到Leslie Scalapino 是很重要的佛教诗人，那个 avant-garde 诗人，他是 1980s and 90s， 现在他出去了，maybe 10年以后或以前，but her work is Tibetan, and it's really good. It's really sophisticated, Madhyamaka, Nagarjuna inspired language, and it's very, very like kong 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 kong, this kind of like very sophisticated philosophy poetry, and there are a few others. There's a Huaqiao Ren, 他说 Mei Bersenberg, who has some Tibetan Buddhist influence as well, and high-end mathematics there. So there's avant-garde still uses the Buddhist theory, but they tended to go toward the Tibetan, not the practice, not like Ginsberg. Ginsberg yes is Tibetan, at the end, right? Father, death, come, and then he sings the songs, but the poetry doesn't have the philosophy that's really innovative in the language. His content is very Buddhist and very shocking, and very powerful. But he wanted everyone to get the influence. He was a missionary. Ginsberg was a Buddhist missionary, like Fenollosa. He wanted people to become Buddhist. Leslie Scalapino is writing for an avant-garde small audience, using English in totally new ways to transmit Nagarjuna's thinking, and so that's a different branch of Tibetan. So the second book was going to take the story further and show these different kinds of Buddhist practices, and some Taoist. There's one Taoist poet, Arthur Weaver, and 他是很厉害。He has 现在出版了三本，他的诗都受到很大的道教不是道家的影响，因为他有很长的时间学内丹，是的，所以他用内丹to heal his psychology, and he's 比我大差不多，说是African American 黑人，really big， 但是他的心意传是特别厉害，这是哇！我看到他的心意，觉得是真的，在美国没有看到那么好的功夫。我的爸爸是功夫老师，是不是？所以他是很厉害。So he's really interesting for the Taoist influence， 但是没有很多人，只有他可能有一个我不知道的人，罗隐的翻译家梅丹妮有，因为他读，他学到有易经，还有别的词。我觉得如果他写诗，他写比较。
他用中文写。
也是，我出版了他的中文诗。
有很多科学的成分。
对是他有一定有，因为没有那么多写英文诗的时候，但是。他是梅丹妮，当然有但是没有很多人有道家的影响，但是佛家是那么多不同的那我刚说 right， 那这个也是 Macintosh， 是可能是美国最有名的佛教诗的影响的诗 right， the Mac。太极拳的影响在美国，就是你的陈氏的陈氏，我也学到陈氏在 San Francisco 2年，我的师父他是比较有名的在 San Francisco， 但是陈氏是不是那么多陈氏 太极拳是样式差不多跟中国一样，没有孙也很少，武也没有很多。样式听了那么多，每一个城市有10多了样式太极拳老师。
天下太极是一家，但是现在这个都是一样的，就是所有的不管孙氏、杨氏、陈氏、吴氏都是一家，它的理论都是一样。
对，但是我每一个是不同，是不是？那个孙那个吴都是有很多复杂的小的动物 movement，right？ 杨没有它，陈是有快的，然后好厉害，可以 hurt yourself。时间到了吗？好。所以如果要
继续切磋的话，可以下面院子里切磋啊，推手。
对手。
最后还是谢谢陈老师，好吧？
谢谢。
到那个6号还有最后一场讲座，大家可以继续来关注啊，继续来讨论，好吧？谢谢李老师。
好，谢谢。
好，谢谢大家，谢谢啊。
谢谢。
好吧。